Okay, everybody, I'm going to start. I want to be able to see the chat, so I'm actually going to put my PowerPoint just in this mode rather than presenter mode, if that's okay. So I'm here today to talk about getting more women into leadership positions. Obviously, the major focus of this is in order to try to make sure we have more women in leadership positions and get them into more VP, SVP, etc., etc. As you know, as everybody I'm sure knows here, there is the higher up the corporate ladder you go, the fewer women. It's worse for women of color, and basically it starts really at the first manager role that women actually have. So we actually progress a lot slower than men do as well. And a lot of the time, people assume that's because women don't ask for promotions, and we're promoted a lot slower than men are. Entry level, which is a really important one, are about 18% less likely to be promoted than women are. And that is, a lot of people say that's because we don't ask, and that is absolutely not true. It is not because we're not asking for promotions. We what we find is that people who get supported tend to get promoted. People who get sponsored and mentored tend to get promoted. And the other piece of it is that so we're not providing real sponsorship and support for women internally in a lot of organizations in a formalized way or informal. But also you find that a lot of men apply for jobs when they have about 60% of the ability, and they think they can do about 60% of the job, whereas women wait till they're doing about 150% of that role, which is something that we have to teach women, that they can actually lean into a role when they still have things to learn in that role. There's a really interesting piece of research where it's women put their hands up for a lot more non-promotable tasks, like taking meeting minutes, organizing events, getting lunch, that kind of thing. And basically they put that energy into those kind of selfless things rather than into things that ensure they get promoted to the next role, which is really interesting. So things have got a little better, as we all are aware. But so this is an example, though, that I looked at recently of what comes up on Career Women when you look up Getty Images, which is what we use in the organization. So, it's still, there's no real such thing as career man, which I find interesting. Female CEO is something that everybody talks about. They don't talk about just male CEOs. So it's not exactly fantastic. So what can we do about it? And I'm very real believer in action trumps anxiety. I think there's a lot of anxiety around women, especially around what's happened with COVID, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So these are kind of things that we can talk about right now. Okay. So one of them is just not sorry. Women apologize a lot. And I think, that's fantastic, Natasha. That's brilliant. Mentees to mentors, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The Just Not Sorry Gmail plugin is really interesting. The fact that we would even need something like this that says your tone is actually self-deprecating. So there's a plugin you can get for Gmail that kind of analyzes your emails and underlines what's self-deprecating or what's making you seem really passive or something like that, which is really interesting. We also, I think, need to own our own success. So a lot of the time and I do this all the time, when people say, really well done, it was a great event or whatever, I'll go as a team, or we were really lucky with the timing or whatever it is, whereas men will go, yeah, that was me, thank you very much, kind of thing, right? So that's really interesting as well. So owning our success is really important, and not just deflecting all that over to somebody else. The other piece that's really interesting is that what men constitute of offensive behavior is much, much higher threshold than women have. So, and I realize this is very binary, as in men and women. I realize there's a whole spectrum of genders, but right now this is what I'm talking about. So what men would need to apologize for would be much more offensive than what women feel the need to apologize for, which is really interesting. So we spend a lot of time doing that. The next one is bossy is a word, especially with girls, is a very negative word, and it's perceived as really bad and negative, and we should be getting rid of it. So the Lean In and Girl Scouts did a really nice piece of work in the US about 2 years ago around banning basically the word bossy, and basically talking about it in terms of leadership skills. And this actually happened in my house, where one of my daughters came home and said that she'd been called bossy in school, and it was like a really bad thing. I was like, well, what's wrong with that? That's great, your leadership potential. So that's really interesting. So using words really matter. They really matter how we use them, especially to girls and about girls and in front of girls. So I think that's really, really important, is banning bossy. This is where Natasha and I might come to rouse. I think it's all about getting sponsorship, not mentoring, right? I do believe women, in a lot of cases, are mentored to death, and we have a lot of people telling us what we should do and shouldn't do. We do not have a lot of people talking about us when we're not in the room. And if you think about it, a coach talks to you, a mentor talks with you, whereas a sponsor talks about you. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get more people in the organization who are in positions of power to make sure that that they're speaking about really high value women in the organization, to make sure that people get promoted and people get opportunities for their roles. There's a really annoying Mike Pence piece, which is actually not just Mike Pence, and it's not about politics. It's just that he kind of embodied it for a little while last year. Basically, his view is that he didn't want to be alone with a woman, and I think the if you look at what mentorship or sponsorship is available to a lot of junior women, it's men, because they're in the positions of power. It's invariably white men, because they're in the positions of power. So men shying away from mentoring women is really difficult. And it also underlines that age-old thing of that, you know, men can't be in the same room as a woman because they won't be able to control themselves, which is nonsense, obviously. So getting a sponsor is incredibly important. The other one is meetings. I have a huge issue a lot of the time with how women sit at meetings and how women take part in meetings. And they've shown that a lot of the time women are sitting around the edges, so they won't take up the central role. There's a lot of mansplaining that's happening that is not being picked up by other women in the organization. So I think that's really, really important too. And I think as women, we need to call men out for that, right? We need to make sure that people understand that actually, I think if we can go back to Susan's point, rather than allowing another guy to kind of take Susan's idea and run with it, I think it's really, really important we start to point that out, and that's something we can do right now. We look like spectators instead of participants, and I think that's what's really, really important, that doesn't happen. COVID has really been a massive issue for us here, right? So a lot of people are saying that 45% of women leaders were saying that they couldn't interrupt to get their point across in a lot of the virtual meetings, and I think that's something that really needs to be dealt with. There's a great piece called Ally, which is a piece of software that basically records meetings and determines what proportion of times women were interrupted, talked over, what proportion of the airtime they actually got. And a lot of the time they find that women speak 25% less than men do. So this is all about sharing, right? You have to make sure that the sharing is done in a way that is fair, and that you're starting to pull the right people in, not just letting one or two people talk over everything. So the allyship is really, really interesting to me. I think that's phenomenal. This is really depressing. It starts really young, like really, really young. There's a lot of things in this deck, which obviously you'll get a copy of, but there's a couple of things that were really interesting. Parents are twice as likely to Google, is my son gifted than is my daughter gifted, right? That's just facts. It's about 5 and 6 that girls start to see themselves as less than boys. So really, really early on. And a lot of this is to do with how teachers are taught to control or accept boy behavior, because that's just boys being boys, versus when girls act out, which is really interesting. And the last point there is when children were asked to draw a mathematician or a scientist, girls were twice as likely to draw men as they were to draw women, which is really depressing. And then the harassment piece, which is everyday life for lots of people, found that 1 in 10 American girls under the age of 11 have actually already been harassed. So there's a lot of conversations that need to happen, I think, with children, with boys and with girls, to make sure that they understand exactly what is acceptable, I suppose, and what's not. The other piece that's really important is that hiring needs to change, right? There's a lot of work that's been done around job descriptions and the sexism, inherent sexism in job descriptions that needs to go away. There's various tools out there that you can put your job descriptions through to make sure they're not obviously leaning towards masculine adverbs or adjectives or verbs, and that they're seen as a lot more neutral, right? There's really sad statistics, which is, if you change the name on a CV to a woman's name, there's a 61% differential in them getting a call for an interview. And a lot of women, well, 66% of women, when they're getting performance reviews, get comments about their, inherent character. So you're seen as too pushy, you're bossy, using that word again, that are not really actionable characteristics, right? So men will get commentary on things that are absolutely changeable, measurable, data-based things, whereas women, it's much more usually about their assertiveness and confidence, and they're expected to be nurturing and empathetic. So it's really interesting. So need to rewrite job descriptions and need to change the performance management process for women, because it's failing women an awful lot. The other piece that's hugely important is boards need to be balanced, right? And when people go looking for members of a board, they tend to go looking for ex-CEOs. And obviously, if you think about it, an awful lot of American women are not CEOs, as we know. Of the Fortune 500, I think there's 3 today. And I think it's really interesting to, when you actually try to build out a board, if you want to make it more diverse, you need to make sure that you're looking in areas other than just other boards or other CEOs, because you're not going to find diverse women of color, and you're not going to find women in those places. One of the things that I think is really funny is, well, it's not funny at all actually, but I could talk about conscious and unconscious bias for a long time. But one of the things that was really interesting is Arianna Huffington was on the Uber board a couple of years ago with David Bonderman, and she had started to talk about the data that's out there about how if you have more than 2 women on a board, the company starts to behave in a very different way and becomes a lot more successful. And he interrupted her and said, I know what'll happen, there'll be a lot more chat, which seems unreal that Arianna Huffington is facing the kind of issues that other women in our positions face. But there you go. In the UK, it's you're legally required to have a certain number of women on the board. And they did a piece of research to ask why there weren't more than 1 woman on the board, which is the requirement, right? There's a requirement to have a certain number of diverse people on the board, and this is really well publicized at the time. All the good women have been snapped up, so there's a perception that there's no pipeline of women coming on. Most women don't want the hassle or pressure of sitting on a board. Believe me, we do. It would be phenomenal. You don't need to make that decision for me. So it's really interesting to see how people self-logic this to themselves, and I think that's really interesting. I think it's really important to get white men involved, because they're, in a lot of cases, have the control and can get us involved. There is definitely a concern with some men with mentoring women, because it's being seen as, in some way sexualized or something like that. But I think the other thing that's fascinating is that 50% of men think that women are well represented in leadership, which is really interesting. And I think this also goes to the piece of, there's this concept of, and this really came up in COVID, of the kind of, you've got a second 8-hour shift that you have to do when you get home for childcare and cooking and cleaning and all that kind of stuff. But there's this third idea of an emotional shift, which women do, where they think about birthday presents. They think about how the kids are doing in school. They make sure the dog license is bought. They make, and they're constantly thinking about the next thing, how the lounge is going to be decorated the next time, and all that kind of stuff that they're taking on, and not really, it's not being shared. AI is really interesting. I think AI is incredible, but it's really interesting because it's only as good as the people that are in the room running the software, right? So one of the things that I find interesting is that when my Apple Watch is charging, but when the Apple Watch came out, it tracked everything, but there wasn't a period tracker on it, which just shows that the women were not in the room or not even near the room, to kind of get that as part of what should have been part of it. There's a really brilliant piece of research that was done that looked at the amount of jobs that women would lose versus men as AI took over. So if you look at those, these are the top 10 jobs, that careers that AI is going to wipe out. And if you think about cashiers, 93% of cashiers are going to go, and 73% of cashiers are women. So there's a massive requirement for organizations to upskill women who are in these roles. And I think there's a requirement on us as leaders in organizations to request that if we're in retail heavy jobs, or where there's even comp and benefits managers, which is in every organization, or bookkeeping, that we're upskilling them and getting them to the next level. So I think that's really, really important as well. COVID has been horrific. It has been, as we all know, horrific, and there is now unbelievably 1 in 4 women considering leaving the workforce, and we're looking at going back to 1980 levels of women partaking in the workforce. And if you look at where women usually work, if it's hospitality, it's mostly women. Retail was shut down, it's mostly women. If you also look at healthcare, the majority of healthcare workers are women as well, so they were affected from the frontline perspective as well. And the UN showed that there was a massive increase in domestic violence as well during this time, which again was really well documented. But you're basically looking at, during COVID, women's jobs were 1.8 times more likely to be affected, and even after COVID, there has been a real awakening, I think, by women that they're no longer taking part. So we really have to try and hang on to the women that we have, hire more women, and make sure that we don't have this mass evacuation of women from the workforce, which is going to be really, really difficult to fill. Obviously we're paid less, we all know that, that's again well documented. But what's really interesting is that if you have a 40-year career, you stand to lose about $1 million on average over the lifetime, because you're behind your male counterparts, right? And the pay gap is worse for women with children, Asian, Black women, and Hispanic women, right? So it's much worse from that perspective. Again, that's something that can be proven with really good HCM systems. You can prove if there's a difference in pay. You can also prove if there's specific people who are only hiring the same people as them. So there's various kind of alerts in HCM systems that can allow you to do that. Funding for female founders is really low. It's about 3% of the amount of money that's out there. There's a huge viewpoint that women aren't, tough enough when they talk to the private equity companies. So what's happened now is that a lot of there's been quite a few private equity companies started by women, which is really good. And I think there's the companies with all male founders received funding after their first round 35% of the time, whereas for women it's only 2%. Right, so that there's a massive difference in that, and shareholders of those private equity companies obviously should be holding them responsible for diversity and things like that. there's massive gender gaps. Ryanair is the worst one. But the other thing I would say is that it's really important for men as well, right? It's not pie, okay? And if you look at the impact on men for a non-equal society, they have a much higher proportion of suicide. They get less access to their children after divorce. They get way less funding, from the men's health perspective. And there's a massive impact for men as well as for women. And so that's kind of where I am. And the last thing is, a lot of people, it's all about money. And if we included women in leadership positions and increased equity, you would introduce between 12 and 28 trillion by 2025. So thanks so much for listening. Any questions? I am tara.osullivan@immedis.com. You can get me on LinkedIn. And it's been great talking to you, and good luck with the rest of the conference. And I look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks a lot, everybody.